A fierce fighting dog discovers an abandoned, helpless baby by a dumpster. What happens next will bring tears to your eyes. Roy had been roaming for days, the relentless ache of hunger gnawing at his core. His once mighty frame, honed by countless battles, now felt the strain of exhaustion. Yet something primal drove him forward, an unyielding instinct to survive. Then, carried on the crisp air, a scent reached him, faint and unfamiliar, unlike anything he'd known. His stomach churned in anticipation, his thoughts sharpening with the promise of prey. Every muscle in his body awakened, his senses converging into the focus of a hunter. With deliberate steps he crept forward, his massive body moving with fluid precision. The scent grew stronger, drawing him deeper into the overgrown terrain. He stilled his breath, listening intently. A faint sound brushed against his ears, so fragile it barely disturbed the silence. It was alive. His pulse quickened, saliva pooling in his mouth as his pace accelerated, threading through the tall grass. And then he saw it. Cradled within a bundle of worn blankets was a baby, a tiny, helpless human, its feeble cries like whispers against the vast quiet. Roy froze, his eyes locking onto the fragile figure. The smell that had lured him, the hunger that had driven him, wasn't for prey. It wasn't food. It was this delicate, defenseless being lying exposed before him. His instincts screamed for retreat, urging him to turn away before hunger could consume reason. But something new, something foreign held him captive. It surged within him, unyielding yet incomprehensible. Roy edged closer, his looming presence casting a long shadow over the infant. The baby whimpered, its weak voice stirring something deep within him, an ache he had never known. Hunger clawed at him, yet another force, stronger and stranger, began to rise. It was the drive to protect. He didn't understand its origin, but as he stared at the child, his fierce, predatory instincts began to ebb. Roy lowered his head, his breath brushing the fragile body. A low, questioning whine escaped him, uncertain, yet tender. Slowly, he eased himself down, curling his massive frame around the infant like a living barrier. The baby's warmth seeped through the frayed blankets, a fragile heartbeat tapping softly against the night. And in that moment, Roy realized he would not walk away. As darkness settled, the air cooled, carrying with it the chill of the approaching night. The baby trembled, its frail cries tapering into faint murmurs. Roy nudged it gently, instinctively offering his own warmth. A deep growl rumbled through him as hunger twisted his stomach, but he pushed it aside, ignoring the trembling weakness that threatened his body. The child shifted again, letting out a soft, plaintive sound that sparked a protective surge within him. Roy's muzzle brushed against the baby's face, the unfamiliar scent now oddly soothing. Somehow, this tiny creature had become his charge. Hunger was irrelevant now. He lifted his head, scanning the dim horizon, his ears tuned for any hint of danger. The open expanse around them offered no safety. Shelter was imperative. Rising on stiff legs, he carefully gripped the edge of the blanket between his teeth, lifting the baby with delicate precision. Step by cautious step, Roy moved forward, each sound of the night a potential threat. The rustling leaves, the distant call of an owl, the damp scent of earth, all filled his senses as he sought refuge. His muscles strained under the weight of both exhaustion and his fragile cargo, but he pressed on, driven by a singular purpose: to protect the child. The cold deepened as night enveloped them. Roy's legs burned with fatigue, each step an effort of will, but his resolve never wavered. The landscape around them shifted, shadows stretching into unfamiliar shapes. Yet Roy moved forward, a steadfast guardian, the world narrowing into a singular mission, ensuring the baby's survival. The barren landscape had slowly transformed into a wilderness of dense brush and scattered trees. Shadows played tricks among the foliage, their movements keeping Roy on edge. His ears twitched with every faint rustle, his tension coiled tight as a spring. The faint scent of water drifted through the air, teasing him. It was subtle, but undeniable, and the thirst clawing at his throat grew unbearable. His tongue felt dry and cracked. The baby, cradled against him, was even more fragile, its faint whimpers weakening with each passing moment. Roy's instincts surged, driving him forward with renewed urgency as the scent of water became stronger, like a beacon pulling him through the thicket. At last, through the clustered trees, he spotted a small creek winding through a grove of shrubs. Relief washed over him like the cool promise of the water ahead. Roy carefully placed the baby on the soft earth nearby and plunged his muzzle into the creek, gulping the icy liquid. It soothed his parched throat, momentarily easing the exhaustion that had weighed him down. After quenching his thirst, he turned his attention to the baby. Using his nose, he nudged the blanket-wrapped child closer to the creek's edge. With gentle care, he scooped a small amount of water with his nose, wetting the baby's lips. The child stirred faintly, its tiny movements drawing toward the moisture. For a moment, Roy simply watched, his protective instincts deepening into something more profound. A loyalty he hadn't felt since the day he'd been left behind. This small, fragile life had become his purpose, a connection he hadn't known he needed. Determined, he scanned the surrounding area. They needed a secure place for the night, somewhere shielded from the growing chill and potential dangers. Gently taking the baby in his mouth once more, Roy set off again, leaving the creek's soft murmur behind. The forest thickened as he moved, the wind muffled by the denser canopy. Ahead, a cluster of large rocks caught his eye, their arrangement forming a natural overhang. It was far from perfect, but it offered shelter. He carefully laid the baby within the rocky alcove, positioning himself to block the night's chill from reaching the child. Curling his body protectively around the tiny bundle, Roy closed his eyes, allowing exhaustion to take over. His hunger and discomfort could wait. For now, his sole mission was to protect this helpless infant who had somehow become his own. When dawn's first light crept through the trees, Roy stirred. His body had instinctively shifted closer to the baby during the night, sharing warmth. The child's soft breathing was a fragile melody, a rhythm Roy found himself attuned to as the dark gave way to morning. But this temporary refuge was insufficient. They needed something sturdier, a place that could shield them from both the elements and unseen threats. A faint rustling broke the morning stillness, sending a jolt through Roy. His ears pricked, his muscles tensed, but it was only a small animal scurrying through the underbrush. The immediate danger passed, but the moment reignited Roy's urgency. They couldn't stay here. Taking the baby carefully in his mouth, he set off again, navigating the increasingly dense forest. The air grew damp, the ground cold beneath his paws, and the weight of the baby tested his endurance. His legs trembled with exhaustion, but he pushed on, spurred by the life he carried. Before long, Roy faced his first true challenge. A steep hill, slick with morning dew, looming before them. He paused, studying the slope. The climb would be grueling, especially in his weakened state. But there was no alternative. Lowering his head, he took a tentative step forward. His muscles screamed in protest, his body stretched thin from hunger and fatigue. The baby's weight made the climb precarious, forcing him to dig his claws into the muddy terrain for grip. His breaths came in heavy pants, but he pressed forward, one painstaking step at a time. At one point, he slipped, his back legs skidding in the damp earth. He growled softly, steadying himself and tightening his hold on the baby's blanket. Failure wasn't an option. Slowly but surely he scaled the hill, his trembling legs fueled by sheer willpower. At the top he paused, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. Glancing down, he reassured himself that the baby was still safe, its tiny face barely visible within the folds of the blanket. Beyond the crest of the hill, the forest opened into a clearing. On the far side, shrouded in early morning fog, stood a crumbling cabin. Its weathered structure was little more than a skeleton of what it once had been. But to Roy, it was salvation. A roof, walls, and the promise of safety. Without hesitation, he started toward it, his determination as unyielding as the bond he now felt to the life he was protecting. Roy's heart swelled with a bittersweet relief as he drew a steadying breath and stepped forward. At last, he had found a place where safety seemed within reach. The early morning fog blanketed the clearing ahead, muting the world around him. Yet, there was a sharp unease in the air, an invisible weight that made his fur stand on end. Pausing, Roy scanned his surroundings with sharp, vigilant eyes. The baby let out a soft whimper, and he bent down, nudging it gently with his nose to soothe it. But his body remained tense, every muscle coiled and ready to spring. Suddenly, movement flickered at the edge of his vision, a shadow darting between the trees. Roy's heartbeat quickened. Then he saw them, glowing yellow eyes glinting from the underbrush. One pair, then another, and another. Coyotes. They had been waiting, tracking him, and now they had him and the baby in their sights. Roy's body went rigid, a low, guttural growl rising from deep within his chest. The coyotes crept forward, their sleek bodies low to the ground, eyes locked on him with predatory intent. Carefully, Roy lowered the baby onto the cold earth behind him, placing himself as a shield between the fragile child and the advancing threat. The exhaustion from his days of hunger fell away, replaced by a fierce, primal protectiveness. Every sense sharpened as he prepared to defend the life behind him. The leader of the pack stepped closer, teeth bared in a savage snarl, its eyes narrowing with deadly focus. Roy held his ground, his powerful frame braced, his growl deepening as a warning. He was only one dog, weakened from the harsh journey, yet he would not retreat. The baby's vulnerability strengthened his resolve. A sudden lunge from one of the coyotes broke the tense standoff, and Roy met it head-on, his jaws clamping down on its shoulder. The coyote yelped and retreated, but another lunged, sinking its teeth into Roy's shoulder. He snarled in pain, but thrashed violently, dislodging his attacker. For a moment, they surrounded him, snapping and circling, their movements quick and coordinated. Roy's growls rumbled like thunder, and his fierce determination seemed to unnerve the pack. The leader hesitated, its gaze locking with Roy's. Something in his unyielding stare, a promise of relentless defiance, seemed to send a clear message. One by one, the coyotes retreated, fading back into the shadows, their glowing eyes the last to vanish. Roy remained on high alert, scanning the tree line until he was certain they were gone. Blood dripped from his wounds, each throb of pain a reminder of the battle. Still, he turned back to the baby, nudging it gently to ensure it was unharmed. Satisfied, he carefully adjusted the blanket around the child and picked it up again, his steps faltering as he limped toward the cabin ahead. Shelter was close, and nothing would stop him from reaching it. The cabin was a modest structure, its roof sagging at one corner and broken windows streaked with dirt. Despite its disrepair, it was a sanctuary, a haven from the biting wind and prowling predators. Roy pushed the door open with his shoulder, its rusty hinges groaning as it swung inward. Dust stirred in the air as he stepped inside, the dim light of dawn filtering through the cracks and broken panes. He laid the baby gently on a patch of dry earth near the wall, positioning himself protectively between the child and the door. The golden morning rays lit up the baby's face, its tiny hands twitching softly in its sleep. Roy nudged the blanket snug around it, his protective instincts calming as he watched the baby's steady, shallow breaths. A quiet sense of peace settled over him, unlike anything he had ever felt before. Slowly, he lowered himself beside the child, curling his body to block the cold drafts seeping through the cabin's gaps. Pain radiated from his wounds, and hunger clawed at him once again. But these discomforts felt distant now. His purpose was clear, grounding him in a way he'd never known. Protecting the baby was his mission, his reason to endure. He lay still, his head resting on his paws, ears twitching at every groan and creak of the old building. When the baby stirred, he lifted his head, sniffing the air to ensure all was well. A soft, reassuring whine escaped him, a gentle promise that the child was safe. The hours crept by in quiet stillness, sunlight streaming gently through the cracks in the cabin's broken windows, wrapping the space in a fragile warmth. Roy lay close to the baby, his massive body a shield, his sharp ears twitching at every sound beyond the fragile walls. For the moment they were safe. The baby slept soundly, its tiny chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, while Roy allowed himself a rare moment of relaxation. Yet the silence carried its own weight. A faint crunch in the brush pulled Roy from his reprieve. His ears snapped upright, his muscles coiling as he caught an unfamiliar scent, human. Instinct gripped him as the sound of footsteps grew louder, inching closer to their fragile haven. A figure emerged from the tree line, a woman dressed in hiking gear, her face streaked with sweat and weariness. Her cautious expression shifted to confusion and concern as her gaze landed on the dilapidated cabin. She hesitated, likely drawn from the nearby trail by the sight of shelter, her body betraying both exhaustion and curiosity. But when her eyes adjusted to the shadows inside, catching sight of Roy, she froze. There he was, a hulking, battle-scarred dog, crouched protectively near a bundle of worn fabric that cradled the baby. His piercing gaze locked on hers, unwavering yet surprisingly measured. Her breath caught as she instinctively raised her hands, palms up in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to hurt you," she said, her voice calm but layered with compassion that seemed to cut through the air like a balm. Roy didn't move at first, his broad frame still blocking the baby, but the woman's voice carried something unfamiliar to him, a soft sincerity that coaxed a flicker of trust. His posture remained firm, but his sharp, wary gaze softened slightly. The woman, reading his subtle shift, took a slow, deliberate step forward. Her eyes darted to the baby, pale and fragile, as if it hadn't been cared for in days. Her heart ached at the sight, understanding in an instant what had unfolded here. This dog, scarred and fierce, had defied the odds to keep the child alive. "Is it okay if I come closer?" she asked, her tone gentle, careful. Roy didn't move, but his stiff stance relaxed just enough to suggest he understood her intentions. She knelt, her movements deliberate and slow, and stretched out a hand to touch the baby's blanket. The child stirred, its tiny form shifting under her fingers, and Roy's head dipped, his sharp eyes never leaving her. The woman straightened, a newfound resolve glinting in her gaze as she reached for her phone. Her fingers trembled as she dialed, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, I've found them," she said, her tone urgent, yet filled with awe. "There's a baby and a dog. You're not going to believe this. The dog, he's been protecting the baby. We need emergency services right away." As she spoke, her eyes flickered back to Roy, shimmering with tears. "You did so well," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her emotions. "You kept this baby safe. You're a hero." Her words seeped into Roy's wary heart, and for the first time in what felt like ages, he allowed himself to feel a flicker of peace. He lowered his massive frame beside the baby once more, resting his head near its tiny form, as if reassured that his duty was nearing its end. Moments later, the distant wail of sirens broke the calm, growing louder as they approached. Roy lifted his head, his ears twitching as his protective instincts flared. The baby stirred beside him, its small fists curling as the cabin filled with the hum of approaching help. The first responders moved cautiously, their training preparing them for the large, protective dog they'd been warned about. Their eyes quickly landed on Roy, his scarred body positioned over the baby like a guardian of treasure. Roy's ears flattened, a low growl rumbling in his throat, a final act of defense against the unknown. One of the paramedics, an older man with kind eyes and a calm demeanor, knelt before Roy, his every movement deliberate. "Hey there, buddy," he said gently, his voice steady and soothing. "You're okay. We're here to help." He extended a hand, giving Roy time to catch his scent. "You've done an incredible job, keeping this little one safe." The tension in Roy's body ebbed, the growl fading as he assessed the man's sincerity. His heavy head drooped slightly, exhaustion catching up to him. The paramedic moved with care, wrapping the baby in a clean, warm blanket and lifting it into his arms. Roy watched every motion, his body tired yet steadfast, until the baby was cradled safely. As the responders prepared to leave, the woman cast one last glance at Roy, her voice soft and reverent. "You're amazing," she murmured. Roy's eyes followed her, his steady gaze reflecting a quiet understanding. For the first time in days, he lay back, his guard easing. His work was done, and the world felt just a little safer. The baby let out a faint, plaintive cry, and Roy's ears perked up, his sharp eyes locked onto the paramedic. He refused to look away until he was sure the child was safe. As the paramedics carried the infant toward the ambulance parked nearby, Roy tried to stand. His legs trembled beneath him, his body drained of strength. One of the rescuers knelt beside him, placing a firm but gentle hand on his side. "Take it easy, big guy," she said softly, her voice calm and reassuring. "You're coming with us too. You've earned it." Roy let himself be guided toward the waiting ambulance. His strength finally gave out, and he sank onto the soft blanket they had laid down for him. For the first time, he allowed his eyes to fully close, a deep trust settling in as he realized the baby was safe now. Even through the haze of exhaustion, he could hear their voices, awestruck and filled with respect, murmuring about his bravery and unyielding loyalty. By the time they reached the hospital, the story had already spread. A small crowd had gathered outside, eager for a glimpse of the heroic dog who had risked everything to protect a vulnerable child. Camera flashes lit up the evening as Roy was carefully lifted from the ambulance. People whispered in hushed tones, their admiration palpable. As he was carried inside, one of the paramedics paused, gently scratching behind his ears. "You're a hero. You know that?" she whispered, her eyes glistening with emotion. Roy, barely conscious, let out a soft huff, his head sinking back onto the blanket. He had done what he set out to do. He had saved the child. Inside the hospital, Roy rested on a soft mat, his body finally able to relax. His wounds were cleaned and treated, his fur washed, and his hunger eased with nourishing food and water. Yet, even as he drifted in and out of sleep, his thoughts remained tethered to one thing: the baby. In a nearby room, nurses and doctors worked tirelessly to care for the child. Malnourished but stable, the baby had quickly become a source of awe and affection. Word of Roy's courageous act spread quickly, eventually reaching a young couple who had recently faced the heartbreak of infertility. Moved by the story of loyalty and survival, they felt an inexplicable pull, not only toward the child but also toward the dog who had risked it all. A few days later, Roy stirred at the sound of familiar voices. His ears twitched, his instincts immediately recognizing their tone. He lifted his head to see the couple approaching, the baby cradled securely in their arms. As they knelt beside him, Roy tensed, his amber eyes focused intently on the child. When they lowered the baby toward him, tiny fingers reached out, brushing against his fur. A surge of warmth flooded through him, as powerful as the instincts that had driven him to protect the child that night. The woman placed a gentle hand on Roy's head, her voice soft and full of gratitude. "You saved our little one," she murmured, her eyes brimming with emotion. "We'd love for you to stay with us, Roy. You're family now." Roy looked up at her, something deep within him stirring. This wasn't just shelter. This was a family, a pack, a bond stronger than anything he'd known. With a low, contented sigh, he pressed his head into her palm, his heart swelling with a feeling he hadn't experienced before: belonging. In the weeks that followed, Roy adjusted to his new life, one filled with laughter, warmth, and purpose. Each morning, he would wake by the baby's side, watching over the child as it slept peacefully. His once hardened heart softened with every giggle, every tiny hand that reached for him, tugging at his ears or brushing his fur. The scars of his past, both seen and unseen, faded into distant memories, replaced by the tenderness of a new chapter. Roy was no longer a fighter wandering through uncertainty. He had a home, a purpose, and a family who embraced him with open arms. As months passed, Roy became an inseparable part of the family. The baby, now stronger and lively, toddled around the house, always under Roy's watchful eye. The child's laughter filled the air as tiny fingers explored Roy's soft fur. On sunny afternoons, they played in the backyard, the baby's wobbly steps always shadowed by Roy's protective presence. Every movement of his body was careful, deliberate, his instincts as sharp as ever, but now guided by love. The mother would often glance over, her heart swelling with joy as she watched the gentle dog who had once been a fierce protector transform into a devoted guardian. On one such afternoon, she smiled, taking in the sight of her child toddling toward Roy, the two of them sharing a bond that was pure, unspoken, and unbreakable. For Roy, the journey from survivor to protector had come full circle. This was his family. This was his purpose. And his heart, once battered, now overflowed with a love he had never thought possible. She knelt beside Roy, her fingers gently tracing the contours of his thick, velvety fur. "You're a miracle. You know that?" she murmured, her voice soft with gratitude. Roy's tail gave a slow, rhythmic wag against the cool grass, his eyes locking onto hers with a quiet wisdom that transcended words. In those soulful depths, she saw it all. The unyielding loyalty, the resilience that had carried him from a life of abandonment and despair to one of unwavering love and belonging. As the golden light of the setting sun bathed the backyard in a warm glow, Roy lowered himself onto the earth. Beside him, the baby nestled close, her tiny form fitting perfectly against his side. Together, they slipped into a tranquil slumber, enveloped in the safety and comfort of their shared world. For Roy, his last thoughts, before the embrace of sleep, were simple, yet profound. He was home, and he was cherished. The tale of Roy and the baby quietly wove itself into the fabric of local lore, a testament to resilience, unshakable loyalty, and the boundless reach of kindness. Roy had proven that love held the power to heal even the most fractured souls, and that the most unexpected connections often forged the strongest, most enduring bonds.